Welcome to DayZ Stories. This new format will consist of narrating the episodes from the Chronicles of Miller. Frozen Revenge. I recorded this story during the first 3 weeks of the early access campaign for DayZ Frostline. To participate in this campaign, you had to be a content creator with at least 1,000 followers on Twitch, YouTube, or Kick. This resulted in a unique experiment in DayZ history, as the servers were full of content creators from all over the world. In just a few weeks, I was able to meet and become known by other content creators who I still follow to this day. Practically every player on the server had a good microphone, and not only that, they were eager to use it. Most of them were recording or streaming, which made the interactions great, even when they were hostile. You could literally hear people screaming in the middle of a firefight, which gave it a unique immersion, like a role-playing server, but without the rules. My new channel had just reached 1,000 subscribers, and I was able to get into the early access for DayZ Frostline on its map, Sakal. This map simulated an island in Siberia, inspired by the real Sakhalin Island located in eastern Russia, just north of Japan. For those who don't know, on this channel, I'm developing a lore that connects all my DayZ and Arma episodes. In the future, this lore doesn't have to be restricted to just these games. Any game that allows me to develop stories could be a good candidate, such as Grand Theft Auto, for example. That is, the game is a render engine for stories and images. Arma and DayZ give me the perfect platform, as they have the following elements: a huge map with resources and opportunities, and a good player base that can be hostile or friendly, depending on their mood. In addition to this, the game's economy is very harsh, and if you die, you lose everything. This causes players to behave in unique ways, and this context allows for one-of-a-kind stories to occur. Furthermore, the action happens in a slightly more intense way than in a generic run-and-gun game. It is in this context that the story of the main character, Miller, unfolds. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, as I wouldn't be able to cover the topic of this video, but I'll give you a summary so you can understand a little. Ulysses Miller is a mercenary with extensive military experience, who finds himself involved in collecting key samples to develop a cure that will save the world from the zombie-type infection caused by the Z virus. It's important to note that the lore of the Chronicles of Miller is independent and doesn't necessarily have to resemble that of DayZ or the war contexts of Arma, although I do try to make it fit with the experiences of the games. For example, I won't put in a zombie dragon, as there aren't any in DayZ or Arma. Additionally, I'm trying to bring these worlds and characters to life with the maximum possible realism. The Chronicles story is divided into 4 major phases. The first is Miller's experience in the Cultist War. Miller infiltrates behind enemy lines and collaborates with the local rebel forces of Cultists as part of his role in Special Forces. I mainly tell this stage on my previous YouTube channel called Click Storms, which is linked in the description. I told this phase with gameplay from Arma 3 Wasteland, Alti's Life, and Exile. In the second phase, Miller becomes a high-level mercenary, working for various contractors and ending up involved in the search for the Z virus both before and after it spreads. In this phase, the mercenary becomes trapped in Chernobyl, which in the Chronicles would be the Czech Republic. The character's story takes a more purely survival turn due to a helicopter crash during the insertion of one of his sample collection missions. Miller is separated from his comrades because a horde of zombies, attracted by the fire, rushes the crash site. We could say that the protagonist and his squad arrive in Chernobyl via one of the famous heli crashes that occur as dynamic events within the game. In the final phase, Miller takes his mission all over the world. Thanks to what little is left of his organization and the help of multiple key survivors, Miller will arrive at Namalsk Island, where he will have to decide whether to risk everything or save his future. In the Chronicles, I do something similar to what the famous series Lost does, as the episodes do not follow a linear chronological order. Instead, I constantly jump through time between these stages using fast forwards or flashbacks. I understand this isn't ideal, but it's the best I can do considering that sometimes I play Arma, other times DayZ, and sometimes one map or another. In the story, each map has its moment, so if I play DayZ Namalsk, I'll be filming an episode of the end of the Chronicles. But if I then release an episode of Arma Reforger, we'll be talking about the second phase, where Miller works as a contractor before the Z virus outbreak. Well, thanks to this structure, I can develop the story in a way that doesn't conflict with itself, while giving me the freedom to incorporate events and characters that I don't yet know. What I've really done is draw a framework or context that can accommodate almost anything that happens to me in the gameplay. My intention is to be a kind of bizarre app who features a different artist in each session, but in my case, each episode will have a series of different characters. Some are reputed content creators, and others are as anonymous as any of the players we encounter on a run. Well, with enough context, we transport ourselves to Sakhalin Island in eastern Russia, north of Japan. It's an island characterized by low temperatures, low population density, and a gigantic volcano that dominates the landscape. This episode occurs in Phase 3 of the Miller Chronicles. It is understood that Miller has already been surviving the spread of the Z virus for several years. Little is left of Miller's team and his organization, but they still have a frigate and a network of contacts that allows samples to be transported to several laboratories, collaborating with the research to combat the Z virus. What were once full-kit missions with helicopters, boats, and all kinds of transport are becoming more precarious, where the human element gains more value and there are fewer resources. This is due to the supply problems of a growing global crisis and the political tensions that plague the globe. Different countries adopt different containment and survival measures, making transit between countries very complicated, and even more so for a small contracted force. That is why Shadow Team is beginning to use infiltration tactics, more similar to a common spy than a special forces team. Miller inserts himself into Sakhalin by posing as one of the refugees that Russian authorities send to the island. The objective was to create resistance corps against the infection. Basically to overwhelm the healthy population in remote areas with sheer numbers so that the survivors could establish safe zones free of infection. It must be said that sometimes this strategy backfires and the infection manages to consume the refugee ships that the Russian authorities send to their deaths. It is assumed that the country's armies are greatly depleted, so there are no Russian military personnel protecting the refugees brought to Sakhalin. A state of every man for himself reigns. But of course, due to years of infection, many survivors have become systematic bandits who take advantage of others in every way they can, preying on them. Several of these programs have ended up with a kind of feudal local government led by the bandit chief of the moment. Miller, however, arrives at the beginning of the landings, which fits and provides context for why healthy survivors are suddenly running along the coasts of Sakhalin. The episode begins with Miller on the coast, meeting a survivor named Robert, or Rob. The latter is a content creator named Ark, who is becoming very popular on YouTube and Twitch. Miller was recovering from his wounds on the coast, where he had already spent a couple of weeks, when he encountered Rob. Rob was very friendly from the start, and stated he was going to meet up with several friends of his, inviting Miller to join. The mercenary accepted, and they immediately headed inland. They drank water, warmed up by a fire, and managed to hunt a fox for food. Rob and the survivor established a good relationship while cooking and eating the fox meat, then set off toward the town where Rob was supposed to meet his friends, Lone and Yerman. Yes, the well-known Spanish streamers and YouTubers. This tremendous coincidence occurred. Rob and Miller were caught by a winter storm, which reminded the mercenary of how the last one had almost ended his life. Now we have a flashback to the beginning of Miller's story on Sakal Island. As soon as Ulysses Miller arrived on the island, he headed straight for the base of the Sakal volcano, in search of a researcher his friend Jacob knew. The mercenary had met Jacob in a previous episode set in Livonia, which in the chronicles would be Poland. Well, Jacob was a biologist, and after learning about Miller's mission with the samples, he recommended that he meet this person, as he knew about the research being developed in Sakal. Jacob's scientist acquaintance was investigating super-resistant bacteria that had managed to survive in extreme conditions of cold, heat, and chemical and viral contamination. This last resistance of the bacteria is what caught Jacob's attention as a good indication to research for developing a cure for the Z virus infection. Due to this information, the Shadow team embarked for Sakal on a small mission to contact this scientist. Unfortunately, when Miller reached the campaign laboratory at the base of the volcano, he found the scientist's corpse next to a metal briefcase lying beside it. The scientist lay in a posture that indicated difficulty breathing in his last moments, having just removed his gas mask, but still wearing his NBC suit for chemical and bacteriological protection. Miller managed to open the briefcase with keys retrieved from the lab higher up, and inside, he discovered a sample container that seemed to be the ideal candidate for carrying key samples of the super-resistant bacteria the scientist was investigating. After collecting the samples, Miller took refuge in the campaign laboratory. A storm began, and after searching the rest of the laboratory, the protagonist decided to leave. The area lacked wood or anything to burn to keep warm during the night, and it was also very exposed. If a group of bandits assaulted his position, the mercenary would have very few options to escape. It would be much better to take refuge in a forest cabin, with more resources and the protection of the terrain. Miller set off across the foothills of the Sakal volcano as the storm intensified. He had a shotgun with only one shell, a pistol with 6 shots, and an improvised spear he had used to defend himself from the infected. The storm hindered visibility due to the wind, snow, and fog. Thunder echoed in the mountains like war drums. Then, in the distance, the howling of a wolf pack was heard. At first, Miller thought it might have nothing to do with him, but he was wrong. Several wolf silhouettes quickly appeared in the distance, climbing the hill. They approached him through the fog like ghosts levitating over the snow. At first, Miller aimed at one of the wolves, but then remembered he had almost no ammunition and couldn't afford to miss. So he decided to wait until they were closer. The wolves began to surround the mercenary, who, without a moment's hesitation, started running in a specific direction. He did this on purpose, to constantly force the pack to reposition themselves and to avoid being an easy target. Occasionally, Miller would change direction and angle to threaten one wolf or another. It was then that one got close enough to ensure a shot. The shot crushed the life out of the first wolf, leaving it flattened in the snow. But at the same time, a second wolf bit the man in the leg. It's typical for wolves to cover their companions by attacking from behind. The bite sank into Miller's right leg, giving him a burning sensation, in contrast to the freezing storm that continued to rage. Miller easily shook off the second wolf, threw the shotgun to the ground, and quickly pulled out an old 9mm he kept in his rags. running down the slope, bleeding and stumbling due to the bite. He began to aim at the second wolf. He took his time, with strong winds and snowflakes obstructing his view. A shot at about 8 meters seemed like a challenge even for a veteran like him. A hit. The wolf's whimper was heard, but it continued the chase. This same wolf feigned an attack but exposed itself at an even closer distance, so Miller fired 2 double shots and 1 single shot. With 6 shots in its body, the second wolf collapsed in the snow. The weapon's magazine was empty. Miller holstered his pistol and hurried to pull the spear from his back. Normally, wolves flee when you have killed a number of their pack, but these must have been desperate, or perhaps the third wolf was the alpha. Miller was still bleeding, and the wolf and the man stared intently at each other, face to face. The man took advantage of the tension to quickly bandage his leg wound, but shortly after, the alpha charged the mercenary, managing its first bite. The survivor received a bite to the left chest, and when the wolf retreated, he responded by stabbing its leg with his spear. The animal cried out like a domestic dog, which gave Miller a surge of hope that it would retreat, but nothing could be further from the truth. Man and wolf began a grim dance for their lives, trying to reach each other in a kind of primitive fencing. It was clear that this wolf, having lost its companions, was not going to give up. It was clear that the mercenary had no choice but to fight for his life. What had been a more or less tactical fight had become a death match. The wolf lunged like lightning. Miller defended himself and received another bite to his left shoulder. He had the impression that it had torn flesh, but in the moment, with the adrenaline, he only felt immense heat, as if he had been hit with a hammer. At this point, Miller had 3 bites that were starting to soak his body and clothes. His blood cooled quickly, and mixed with sweat, made him feel soaked. This time, it was Miller who charged, emitting a yell, advancing and thrusting with his spear. The wolf retreated at first, but immediately turned around and counterattacked, costing it another spear thrust to the chest. As the alpha moved out of range, it received 2 more strikes to other parts of its body. It lunged on top of the man, and Miller received a bite while repeatedly driving his spear into the wolf. The wolf backed off and charged again, this time leaping for the neck. Miller raised his spear, and the wolf impaled itself on it. The man noticed the wolf's bite losing intensity as he repeatedly drove the spear tip deeper. Rolling in the snow, the wolf found its grave in the hand-to-hand combat. He had won this one. He had managed to survive, but the victory didn't give Miller a second to celebrate. With the last wolf's corpse still warm, Miller's soaked body demanded mending. The survivor had only 3 bandages, but at least 4 severe bites. Quickly, Miller applied bandages to 3 bites and treated the last one with a dirty rag. He risked contracting an infection, but the bleeding had to be stopped. Limping and using his spear as a crutch, Miller descended the volcano. The wolves' bodies were swallowed by the snow, as if the volcano was claiming them. With great difficulty, Miller glimpsed a destroyed building. At that moment, it was the only shelter he could take, so he went inside and immediately set about making a fire, murmuring, "I've seen better hotels than this." With his last efforts, he lit the fire and lay down near it, where he fell asleep. While Miller slept, someone approached him and stole practically everything. When the mercenary woke up, he realized he had lost the samples he was supposed to extract from the island. He had thought the hardest part of his mission was complete. and he was back at square one. Miller decided to return to the coast, where temperatures were milder than in the mountains, and he could fish to recover for several days without having to move much. After a few days of recovery, he found Rob, and the story of our adventurers continued. Deep inland, Rob and Miller were looting cabins scattered across the territory when Rob told Miller, "Look what I found." He was showing him a hunting rifle in perfect condition with a long-range scope, a dream weapon for survival in these lands. Rob had the courtesy to give the rifle to Miller, who resisted a little, but finally agreed to carry the toy. Shortly after, Rob found a Russian Mosin Nagant rifle in perfect condition with a PU medium-range scope. And so, the two companions continued their march toward the town where Rob was supposed to meet his friends, Lone and Yerman. During a rest stop, Rob showed Miller the destination, a fairly large inland town on Sakal. They only had to cross one of the island's largest mountains, Tapanka Peak. Rob kept in communication by radio, but only turned it on once an hour to save battery. On the way to Tapanka, they heard a deer and decided to take the opportunity to hunt it. In these conditions, one never knows when they might find quality food. Furthermore, they thought they could carry a lot of meat and thus help Rob's friends, who would surely be just as hungry. It must be understood that at these temperatures, with such physical effort, the body consumes double the daily calories. So Rob and Miller prepared to hunt the deer. The sounds came from a dense forest. Miller and Rob signaled to each other and deployed side by side to cover more ground and have more chances of spotting the prey. A shot echoed in the woods. Rob had brought down a huge deer. In the same spot, they proceeded to skin it and take the parts they could carry. A little further down, they found a farmhouse halfway to the town. Freezing, they decided to make a quick fire to warm up. While they were at it, they cooked some steaks on the fireplace grill. Miller was collecting kindling to rekindle the fire when he heard Rob talking on the radio. The mercenary thought it was his friends. Then, the sounds of a firefight began to echo throughout the valley. Rob approached Miller and said, "My friends are dead. I just spoke to one of them. He was wounded, and the sound of gunshots ended the transmission. They told me they were protecting a group of refugees and started taking sniper fire. It can't be. They had a lot of combat experience." Rob made a gesture of mourning and immediately said, "We must take them out." Miller stared intently at Rob as if trying to wordlessly convey that what he was proposing was no small thing. Such a maneuver could cost them their lives too. The mercenary nodded slowly and silently. They gathered their gear and some of the cooked meat and set off at a good pace. The town was only about 4 or 5 kilometers away. Rob was very serious, marching determinedly to eliminate his friend's murderers, and little by little, another storm began to roll in. Rob and Miller approached the town from the southwest, in a high wooded area, with Tapanka Peak behind them. They soon spotted 2 individuals leaving the town. These men appeared to be carrying a lot of gear, and one of them was limping. Both companions thought it was very likely that they were the killers fleeing the town with their bounty of weapons and supplies. Miller quickly found a very stable platform from which to aim, just under a fir tree. However, the individuals entered the undergrowth, and it was difficult to estimate the distance due to not being able to see their full figures and the abundant snow that was falling. Rob and Miller communicated as spotter and marksman. Miller had quickly adopted the role of marksman, and Rob that of spotter. However, the mercenary soon realized that Rob had no experience as a spotter, as Miller was asking for decisions and instructions that were not clearly returned. Normally, the spotter is in command, and Miller was acting as he was accustomed. By not receiving clear decisions, he gradually took the initiative for the action. Rob lacked military experience, but had been a good hunter before the outbreak. At the distance the targets were at, Only Miller could consider an accurate shot, as Rob's scope did not have enough magnification. Miller followed both individuals through his scope. The targets were winding downhill, alternating between the trees. At a certain point, the target stopped by a tree and began making gestures. They didn't know if they were signaling their shooters, were simply cold and warming up, or perhaps were communicating with other Allied observers on the same side of the valley. Rob had lost visual contact, but Miller had the target's location in his scope's reticle. There was no direct visibility as the branches covered them. Miller said to himself, "They must be about 400 meters away," and adjusted the elevation. He asked, "Do I open fire?" To which Rob replied, "If you think you can hit them, yes." The trees swayed forcefully, and the blizzard shot snowflakes in a practically horizontal trajectory, almost completely obscuring the view. It was a good rifle with a good caliber and a scope in good condition, but the conditions were obviously not optimal. Miller declared, as if suddenly deflating the tension, "No, I'm not going to shoot now. There's too much foliage and the wind is too strong." There was a lot of experience in that no. The truth was that Miller and Rob were in a more vulnerable position than it seemed. Miller's rifle didn't have a magazine, and he had to chamber the cartridges one by one, and Rob only had 3 rounds for his Mosin Nagant. In contrast, the target seemed to be carrying multiple automatic weapons, and it wasn't even known if there were more hostiles they were coordinated with. That shot from Miller had a high chance of missing, but the noise of the shot would perfectly alert the hostiles in the area, or perhaps it would give these two the opportunity to perfectly escape, to cover among the forest in the storm, and know how to find their opportunity. If they wanted to exact their revenge, Miller and Rob had to show nerves of steel. The targets descended to the lowest part of the valley, and due to a change in the slope, Miller and Rob lost visual contact with them. Rob wanted to assault them, but Miller stopped him, aware of the difference in equipment. It was at least a 2-on-2 where one side had several automatic weapons, and the other had only a few hunting rifles with little ammunition. It seemed like the perfect conditions to lose. Rob and Miller spent a while looking east and west of the valley, beyond the change in slope, to identify where the targets were continuing their march. They were heavily loaded, and one seemed tired or wounded. They would be easy prey in the right environment. However, Rob was getting impatient. They had spent a good amount of time in the orange zone. In military jargon, the contact rings, or hula loop model, is used to describe the states of mental and physical psychological demand in the phases of an engagement. If we understand red as the firefight, orange would be the phase immediately preceding it. A person with combat experience would last much longer in the red or orange zone, while a person with less experience would burn out quickly just in the orange zone. This can lead to rushed decisions. Miller was aware of Rob's nerves, but in a good shooting zone, it was important not to make a move to avoid detection, especially with the difference in firepower that existed. The advantage was in detecting first and taking down the enemy with sufficient clarity and distance. 20 minutes later, the storm had subsided. Large snowflakes fell slowly to the ground. There was no wind, and the cawing of some birds that had taken refuge in the forest began to be heard. A thin layer of virgin snow covered everything, so tracks would be very easy to find. Rob insisted once more on going to look for them at the bottom of the valley. After all, they hadn't seen them leave the area. Maybe they were distracted, resting around a fire. Miller agreed, but asked Rob to advance one by one, in bounds, to avoid being caught without cover at the same time. Miller and Rob alternately covered each other until they reached the last sighting point. At the bottom of the valley, the vegetation reached knee-height, and the snow had not managed to penetrate the tree canopies, so the two men couldn't find an obvious trail. There were 2 options. Either they had gone east, toward the town they came from, or they had gone west, where there was a small hospital that could be useful if one of the 2 targets was wounded. Miller and Rob bet on going to the hospital. Miller knew how to track, but at that moment, there were such a quantity of tracks going every which way, that it was impossible to decipher which was the last. After walking about 10 minutes, they took an elevated position and saw no movement around or inside the hospital. So, they decided to return to the town where Lone and Yerman had fallen. Rob was impatient about not losing the trail, so he began to quicken the pace. Miller and Rob ran easily through the snow. They were in hunting mode, leaping across the slopes of the southern part of the valley. Occasionally, they would stop and crouch to look for targets in the town. They seemed like two tribal hunters, stopping from time to time to look and then disappearing into the undergrowth again to keep moving. Rob and Miller were reaching the tree line, and below, an open, completely clear field stretched out. It was then that Rob said urgently, "Two men running toward us, right in front of us. Do you see them?" Miller responded in a very calm tone, "Yes, get down. We can't miss this one. We're going to shoot in 5 seconds, okay?" Rob stammered a couple of times, saying, when, and then controlled himself, saying, "Okay, give me a second to get into position." He took off his backpack to be more comfortable. Miller had been a calm companion all this way, but when Rob called out the contact, he completely transformed. The mercenary was a little addicted to combat, and when he entered contact, he displayed a hyper-focused behavior on what he was doing. Miller dropped to the ground and turned laterally to get a visual. Immediately after, he said firmly, "I'm green. Are you green?" It seemed that for a moment, the mercenary was back in a war zone and even forgot that his companion might not understand the jargon. In any case, the situation was clear, and Miller had made it known that they were going to shoot, giving Rob no alternative but to do the same. He knew that in those moments, one had to act with simplicity and let the mind worry only about the essentials. Moreover, the targets were heading directly toward them, a little less than 200 meters away, so Miller and Rob were forced to act for their own survival. The targets were running across the open field as if they were being chased by guilt. They carried several weapons and moved vigorously. From time to time, they changed direction to look behind them. Miller said, "I'll take the one on the right," and Rob responded with a fully concentrated tone, "Okie dokie, I can't see anything right now." Rob seemed to be in the perfect state of concentration to act. Miller waited for Rob to have them in his sights. Meanwhile, he tried to keep his reticle on his target. Gently, whenever he had a clear shot, he said, "Green." Miller could clearly see his target's eyes as they were quickly approaching his position. The closer they got, the fewer opportunities Miller and Rob would have if they missed, and the more they would suffer the automatic return fire. The two targets came fully into Rob's view, and he said, "Shoot when you're ready." Miller held his breath, placed his reticle ahead of his target's trajectory, and a little before it entered the crosshairs, Miller's detonation was followed a few milliseconds later by Rob's shot. Both targets slumped in the snow, as if the same bullet had passed through them both. They fell instantly inert, parallel, a macabre choreography ending in an instant. It had been several hours of searching, several lost opportunities, and it seemed that time wanted to give them the clear chance for revenge that Rob's friends deserved. Miller fired a couple of finishing shots, while Rob ran down the slope to inspect them. Miller joined Rob at the corpses. Rob recognized one of the rifles they were carrying as belonging to Lone. At that moment, Rob began to process the emotions of his dead friends, and with some anger, he searched the corpses, taking the food, ammunition, and other valuables he found. Miller searched the corpses for the sample container that had been stolen from him, but they didn't have it. They dragged the collection of weapons they were carrying and hid them near a tree, then decided to hide in the forest. In a very leafy area of the woods, both men set about preparing a good fire. They ate and drank while spreading clothes near the fire to dry them. Between the storm and the sweat of the run, they had been soaked and frozen. They laughed and celebrated being alive. But Rob soon changed his attitude and said, "I'm going back for the rest." Miller pressed his lips together and slowly nodded. He thought that perhaps someone in the group had the samples that had been stolen from him, and in any case, This hostile group was killing people in the central valley of the island. Miller could also be next during any transit. They returned to the town where they had made the kill, and again, Rob called out another target. An armed man was heading briskly northeast. In that direction was a military prison that was rumored to be taken over by a hostile gang. This group was probably part of that gang. Perhaps someone had discovered the corpses and was returning to raise the alarm. After all, those bandits thought this whole area belonged to them. The new target was out of range of their rifles, so Rob and Miller quickened their pace again. They reached the vicinity of the prison, which had a configuration similar to a concentration camp, with metal fences guarding a large esplanade full of barracks. Behind the prison was a wooded hill, perfect for observing the area from above. Miller didn't hesitate to suggest to Rob that they take a wide detour to position themselves on the elevated ground. Rob nodded, and they began the maneuver. Gunshots were heard at the prison. From the way the shots were fired, it was unclear whether it was a firefight or executions. The forest was very dense, with large bushes. When Miller noticed and tried to look back, Rob was no longer there. Miller stopped for a while and retraced his steps. He saw no trace of Rob, so he decided to continue to the point he had already agreed upon, just in case Rob was also heading there. Miller reached a good position where he could control part of the prison while remaining covered in the forest. He then saw two people engaged in a firefight in the prison's immediate vicinity. People were running from side to side among the trees and shooting. Miller was aiming at several of them, but couldn't discern if Rob was the person they were shooting at. To the left, from Miller's point of view, a semi-automatic rifle like the one Rob had taken from the corpses was heard. This individual brought down two men right before the mercenaries' eyes. At one point, Miller was aiming with the scope, but couldn't discern who was who. It was then that he saw clearly: the clothing, the way he moved. It was Rob. Rob was down there, engaged in a firefight. Miller then realized he could help his companion from his position. Rob had shot down two men, but a third shot at him from some trees. Miller didn't have a visual, but he could see Rob retreating toward the opposite side of the prison. From that location, it was going to be difficult to reunite with Rob. So Miller stayed to try to cover his retreat. Miller spotted a shooter lying in one of the prison's watchtowers. These towers were very large, with internal stairs and several floors with rooms. The shooter was on the top floor, lying on a metal balcony that circled the tower exterior. This target was aiming in the direction Rob was retreating, as if searching for him with his rifle. Without a second thought, Miller placed the reticle on the silhouette, tried to adjust the distance by eye, correcting his reticle, and fired. The roar echoed in the forest. The projectile sparked as it impacted a small fence next to the shooter, and although it seemed to hit him, it wasn't entirely clear. The hostile shooter quickly crawled inside the tower for protection and didn't show himself again. Miller directed his scope toward Rob and saw him move away and disappear into the woods. Rob turned around and looked back for a second to check where the shot had come from, perhaps wondering if it had been Miller. Miller, watching Rob move away, said, "Good luck, friend. We'll meet again."